Happy Thursday. My name is Sarah Howard, and I'm the Youth and Community Services Manager here at the Daniel Boone Regional Library. That way, welcome to our Zoom room. And a reminder to put questions about the birds and things in the chat, and they will only be seen by Dana and myself. So, welcome to some bird fun. We are happy to have Dana Ripper here with us. She's the co-founder of MRBO and works for bird conservation, and that's the Missouri River Bird Observatory, if you didn't know, located in Arrow Rock. I will magically disappear so she can share with us all about here and there birds in their wintering grounds. And we know you're probably wearing shorts right now and fanning yourself, but it is February. So welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you so much, Dana.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share screen here. Let's see. With sound and video for later. Let's see. Come on, Zoom. There we go. Okay. I hope everyone's seeing that slide. You should be. Sarah, please give me a heads up if anything at all is not working. Thank you everyone for coming this evening. Not so wintry, as Sarah mentioned. But we are going to talk a little bit about birds on their wintering grounds, and this is an enormous topic. I'm going to try to get through some sort of like key concepts and key points, and we're going to talk about some of the different species that are wintering here, and then our birds, quote unquote, that breed here in Missouri, where they might be right now. And so, as Sarah mentioned, I'm with the Missouri River Bird Observatory. This is our mission. And you can see a couple different links there. mrbo.org is our website. And then we also have a YouTube channel with a bunch of different really good presentations on it from a lot of guest speakers over the last couple of years. So before I begin, I want to say thanks to Missouri photographers. MRBO runs a photo contest every year, and it is entirely Missouri's wild birds. And a lot of the pictures that you will see, if they don't say something like Cornell or a website that has to do with birds, if you just see a name, that is going to be our Missouri photographers. So I want to thank them for all of these wonderful pictures that make my presentation much more interesting than I could do if I had to do it by myself with my own pictures. So when I was putting together this presentation, it got really complex, I have to say, because I was really trying to focus on birds on their wintering grounds, the topic at hand. But I realized that we really can't talk about that without talking about migration in general, but also some of the ecology surrounding birds, their habitat use, their migration strategies, and things like that. So when I was trying to do this, for any Lord of the Rings fans out there, this is what I kept thinking of was There and Back Again by Bilbo Baggins, because I kept going there and back again with the birds. So I wanted to just go through really quickly kind of the main types of migration. Permanent residents, of course, they do not migrate. They stay in Missouri, specifically year round. And largely they're able to do that because they're able to find adequate supplies of food throughout the year. So that's going to be a really important ecological point, of course. Short distance migrants will move only locally throughout a small area, maybe nomadically, and we'll see a couple of examples of that. Or from higher to lower elevations on a mountainside, for example. Medium distance migrants cover distances from one state to several states. And I'm going to show a couple maps as well. And then, of course, long distance migrants basically move from breeding ranges in the US and Canada to Central and South America. So let's kind of look at that as a visual. So here's our permanent residents. You can see there's one color on that map, purple for year round. This particular species does not move in terms of having specifically a migratory pattern. Within this permanent range, however, individuals or flocks of the same species might move throughout a local area. So just because the bird is considered as a species to have a range that is a permanent resident year-round status doesn't mean that they don't move at all. So we'll keep that in mind. We have medium distance migrants. So you can see here the breeding range is in orange. and the wintering range is in blue. And you can see that concept of like they kind of move the distance of one state or several states, as opposed to our long distance migrants, which, and this is a particularly extreme example of long distance migration. You have a species here that breeds up in Canada and the very northern US, up into Alaska, moves through the yellow, moves through migration through most of the country, and then goes and winters in Central and South America. So this is a long way to fly. So why do this? And this kind of gets at the heart of the idea of here and there. Why are some birds with us now in Missouri during our Northern Hemisphere winter? And why do some birds that breed here leave and go elsewhere? So basically, why migrate? What are the benefits of migration? And I think folks probably know that what birds are trying to do are move from an area where resources, particularly food resources, but also in some cases, things like shelter and water, are decreasing over time. And they're moving to an area where resources are increasing over time. So it's good to think about things like the timing of summer and winter in the northern and southern hemispheres, as well as the relative stability of resources in the tropics. So food, number one resource that basically birds are, and all wildlife really, but birds are able to move more than most wildlife. The primary resource that they want to have in abundance, if possible, is food. And the other resource that affects whether birds migrate at all are nesting locations. So we're not going to talk too much about nesting, of course, because we're talking about wintering birds and the birds that call Missouri home, whether the summer, in the winter, or migrate south for the winter, are not nesting in the south. So we're not going to talk about nesting locations too much, but that's priority number 2. So basically, this is all about timing. The 2 major components of a life cycle, the 2 priorities, are reproduction and survival, particularly survival in winter, when conditions are, of course, usually, today notwithstanding, much harsher than during the breeding season. So there are a number of challenges, of course, that go along with winter survival. Cold is one, and snow cover is another major one. So I bet people saw during that really cold snap that we had preceded by snowfall in what, mid-January that was, I believe. You probably had a lot more birds at your feeders during that time. It was partially the incredibly cold temperatures. They were eating as much as possible to keep their metabolisms up, potentially to store fat for overnight maintenance if possible, and bird feeders are a boon for that. But also because simply the snow cover meant that there were a lot less food resources available. So birds here now, I'm interested if folks aren't shy, if you want to put in the chat some of the answers to different questions. We'd love to hear about them. And I want to see if folks think, who's here with us now in wintertime? What birds are, as far as like guilds and primary food source? Do we have insect eaters still? Do we have fish eaters, seed eaters, fruit eaters? What are the most common guilds of birds in Missouri at this time of year? And I'm going to try and see if I can, yep, I can see the chat. So don't be shy, everyone. What birds do you think are here in Missouri? Do you think we have insect eaters right now? Probably not a lot of them, right? What about fruit? Maybe there is some fruit that does stay on the vine and branch. JL says lots of seed. So say our feeder patrons. Yes. Seed, yep. So it's important to think about habitat because none of this, of course, exists in a vacuum. And when we think of the habitats in Missouri. Very, very broad, very basic types. We have forests, we have grasslands, we have wetlands. So think about the birds that might be either moving through or staying during the winter. Where are these habitats being utilized? And then what about your backyard? Yep, Sally brought up that brown creeper is an insect eater. Absolutely. So are woodpeckers as well. And a couple others, but insect eaters really tend to thin out during the winter time, right? Because there simply aren't as many insects available to them in Missouri. So yep. So really, kind of that was a trick question. All of these are here, but some are more speciose than others. So in some of these guilds, we have far more species that are staying with us in Missouri in the winter time than others. So let's talk a little bit about eagles. Who said Mary Beth said that she's got eagles. Cool. So we do, of course, have eagles breeding in Missouri now, actually several hundred breeding pair, which they've increased wonderfully over the last decades. But in the wintertime, we get even more. And do folks want to speculate why that is? Why do we have eagles coming down? They're a pretty tough bird. You saw that slide a couple slides ago of the eagles fighting over a carcass on snow. They're certainly able to withstand very cold temperatures. So why might they winter in Missouri and leave their more northerly climes? What do you guys think? What resource is going to be more available here in Missouri than in, say, northern Wisconsin in a typical year? I realize that we're experiencing climate change, and so some of this is changing during our lifetimes. All right, let's see. Thank you all for putting stuff in the chat. Yep, rivers not usually frozen, frozen water, less frozen water. They're fishing birds, exactly. So we have more open water resources here in Missouri, typically in the wintertime, unless we experience an unusually harsh, long, low temperature winter. We have our open water, and so eagles can continue foraging here. Yep. And thank you all for talking about snow geese in the chat as well. A couple of people mentioned snow geese, and this is basically a migration map. You can see relative abundance is indicated by the color. The darker the color, the more relatively abundant the counts are of this species, and you can see the week of the year as well. And I'm going to play it again. It's going to go January, February, March, April, May, etc. And you can see the movement of snow geese throughout the year. There we go. So a bird that breeds way up in the tundra, comes down through the prairie potholes, and comes in winters in Missouri and places a little bit further south and east. And I hope folks on here may have seen the tornadoes or hurricanes, just incredibly dense concentrations of snow geese that occur, particularly at our national wildlife refuges and conservation areas. They can number in the hundreds of thousands, and it's an incredible spectacle. So one of the things that I wanted to do is talk a little bit about birds in different habitats throughout this. I mean, we have hundreds of birds in Missouri. We have over 100 during the winter, of course, as well, and we can't go through all of them. But I did want to touch on a couple different habitat types, and one of those is prairies and also wetlands in the form of marshes. And so one of the neatest birds, I think, that uses this habitat type is the northern harrier. You can see a female there on the left and a male there on the right, and you can see the birds range. So they're mainly here in Missouri in the wintertime. I typically see them hunting our prairies, a little bit in emergent marsh habitat as well. And this bird flies, this is a great example by Amy here, in a V formation, pretty low and typically quite slow over the ground. So it has a really distinctive flight pattern. One of the things that I found very interesting about northern harrier is that they're considered a resident bird in some areas. So this purple, again, this is year round. We have breeding birds up here, right, throughout just most of Canada and most of Alaska. And then it can also be a long distance migrant. So basically it has migration strategies from not migrating at all to being a long distance migrant. One of the really interesting things about the species is that it exhibits what is called a leapfrog migration strategy. So the birds that breed further north actually bypass these permanent residents and some of the southern winters, and they actually go farther south. So a bird from, I hope y'all can see my cursor, further north will actually end up further south than a bird that would come from a little bit more southerly of a breeding area. So leapfrog migration. And no one quite knows the exact benefits of the strategy of leapfrog migration, but it is thought that basically birds are minimizing competition from the residents and short distance migrants that they are leapfrogging over when they do these longer distance migrations. But it is a fairly uncommon migration strategy. Okay, I know this is a slide with a lot of birds and a lot of words, and I apologize, but I want to spend a little bit of time on sparrows. And I think that some of the folks that I know that I saw on the participants list, I know you all are probably really tired of hearing me talk about sparrows, but I think they're a really awesome group of birds and they're so beautiful. And there are so many different strategies and geographies that they exhibit as a family that I think they're a really good one to study when we're talking about ecology. So you can see all of the different species, and I think I captured them all. I feel like I'm missing one or two that either breed in or winter in Missouri. So I'm gonna check out the chat again. And if folks want to throw in there, what species do you see on here that is here right now, that is with us in Missouri in February in the wintertime? You can, there's, you know, certainly more than one. You can write down as many as you want. Yep, I got a couple votes for Junco, white-throated and white-crowned. Yep. What else? Anybody else? Yep, Stacy. Yep, song sparrow. Yep. And Terry says, "Yep, American tree sparrow." Harris says, "All right, Karen Stair. Good to see you." Yep, white-throated. Okay, so I'm going to click through, and our birds that have left us right now should disappear off the screen. So grasshopper sparrow does not winter here. Prairie bird, Henslow sparrow, another prairie bird, does not winter here. Those are both those medium distance migrants that go down to the further south United States and a little bit into Mexico. Lark sparrow and chipping sparrow. Chipping sparrow breeds here, does not winter here. And then we have field sparrow and Savannah sparrow, and I made those a little lighter, as you can see there on the screen, because they are not with us in far northern Missouri typically. They winter a little bit more in, they're certainly a lot more common in winter south of I-70. Again, that's something that with climate may be changing a bit, but their traditional range maps show them as not staying in northern Missouri. So of the rest of them, these are the birds that are here in winter, the sparrows that are here in winter. LeConte's is a very special prairie bird that only winters here. White-throated sparrow also, white-crowned. Swamp sparrow, although that's not one that is as easily seen as, say, white-throated, white-crowned junco. So we'll just go on to backyard birds. So these are some of the guys that are in your backyard, certainly white-crowned and white-throated. And junco, those were some of the most common ones just placed in the chat, but these other birds can be in your backyard as well. So I mentioned previously that you probably saw more birds at your feeders during that time of extreme cold and snow cover. Just speaking anecdotally from Saline County, we had the 4 on the bottom during that time period, and we do not usually have them at our feeders. We pretty much always have the ones on top, white crown, dark-eyed junco, and white-throated sparrow. But the 4 on the bottom did happen to show up feeding fervently on the ground during that really bad cold snap that we had in January. Okay, so here's some birds that we see now. But are they the same individuals as in the summer? So are these birds moving? And we don't really know it because they're, the individuals that we see don't look different to us. Or are they the same ones? So what about eastern bluebird? Pictured here, of course, in the snow, does winter here in some numbers. And this is a bird that is probably would be categorized as a medium distance migrant, short to medium distance, depending on where they started from to begin with. So the birds that we have in Missouri during the winter time may be individuals from Wisconsin or Minnesota, say. They are not necessarily the same individuals as breed here during the summer. Another one that we see a lot more of in the wintertime is this bird, the American kestrel. This is another one, like the northern harrier, that is characterized as resident in some places, medium distance migrant in other places, and long distance migrant in yet other places. So unlike the northern harrier, though, this bird does not do the leapfrog migration thing. Basically, birds that breed further north migrate more. Birds that are, as you can see, further south may not leave their breeding areas at all. One thing that I found very interesting is that there was a time when our field guides and our online birding resources didn't necessarily show the entire southern hemisphere, all of South America. Usually they cut off right about the Panama Canal or so. So when I looked up the American kestrel's range map, I was very surprised to see actually its range in South America, which I had not seen before because these maps didn't used to include the whole hemisphere. What about cedar waxwings? Do some folks have cedar waxwings at their places right now? Does anybody go? If you do, go ahead and put that in the chat. So you can see from this range map, we have breeding cedar waxwings up here, birds that are considered as a species, again, to be permanent resident. Okay, Karen says, yes, you have cedar waxwings, great. Yes, yeah, it's a lot of yesos, awesome. You can see that Missouri here is pretty much a year-round place for cedar waxwings. They're very nomadic species. So it is one of the few North American birds that is almost entirely frugivorous. It survives mostly on fruit, and it is one of the only birds that can survive on entirely fruit for months at a time. One of the things that I found interesting about this species is that it is not successfully parasitized by brown-headed cowbirds very often because of the fact that it is so fruit oriented. Fruit is the main part of its diet, and it can feed its young only fruit. And brown-headed cowbird chicks cannot survive on an all fruit diet. So I thought that was interesting, not winter related, but still a very interesting and cool bird. Another thing about this species is that its breeding and wintering areas may change dramatically. So basically it does not exhibit site fidelity as many of our birds do. Many of our birds come back to the place where they have bred previously. And we can see this we started seeing it decades and decades ago with banding studies. Banded birds would return to the places where they had been captured on their breeding grounds, and they return to those areas and nest again and again and again. This species, being highly nomadic, don't necessarily breed in the same places each year and don't necessarily winter in the same places each year. They follow the fruit crop. So American goldfinch, this is one that I feel like we get questions about quite a lot for a couple reasons. One is because it goes into a duller plumage during the winter time, so it does not look like this breeding male that you see on the left-hand side. And so sometimes folks think that they have left the area. And once they get to know their backyard birds a little bit better, they see, oh, that's just, American goldfinches. They're just in their duller winter plumage. However, goldfinches are partial migrants in some places, short to medium distance, and they also exhibit some nomadism as well. So basically, the American goldfinch can be considered to utilize various strategies in its migration and wintering ecology. Okay, so how are birds doing this? And this is, of course, a huge topic. We're not going to get into things like navigation, because one of the things that we do want to get to is the birds that we know from here that are down south already. But I think it's important to think about how they're going from here to there. And we're just really going to talk mostly about the ecology, not all of the different mechanics, but basically how to migrate. So what do y'all think? I think this is really funny. I mean, obviously this is a computer generated image, but my understanding is that historically people did sometimes think that hummingbirds and other very small birds would hitch a ride on larger birds such as geese. But nope, our ruby-throated hummingbird makes an incredible migration. This is the fall migration. So we're seeing a bird starting up here. It was recaptured. This is a banding study 2,000 miles later and then finished down here in Costa Rica. Amazingly, during the spring migration, this species actually flies right across the Gulf of Mexico in one flight, which is quite astonishing given the fact that this is a bird that weighs 3 to 4 grams. So how do birds do that? And some of it is stopover habitat. So here you can see, again, this is one of the relative abundance maps across the year. And you can see the species going, up and down in its migration. So how does something like a hummingbird do these flights? What exactly does it have to do as far as getting ready to make these big migrations? So I thought it was important to think about place, literally like each individual plot of land that a bird might use. And that got me kind of thinking about stopover when birds migrate. So neither here nor there. They're not using it as a breeding location. They're not using it as a wintering location. So in the case of Missouri, there's some species that just use us for a rest stop. They're called passage migrants or stopover migrants. And what resources might they need as they're moving? And if we think about this, are those going to be pretty much the same resources that are needed during the winter season for survival? Because at this point, we're not talking about nesting. We're not worried about nesting sites, but we still need food and water and shelter, cover. And there's been some interesting work done categorizing different habitats. And though folks mostly think of this sort of conceptual framework in terms of stopover, so birds that are just moving, making those big movements in migration. But I think we can also think about it as well when we think about breeding habitat or wintering habitat. So this great concept of full service hotels, convenience stores, or fire escapes. And ecologically, some examples of that are a full service hotel would be something like our national wildlife refuges. And indeed, even though this concept was not really elucidated until recently in this kind of like slightly funny way, right? Full service hotels. This is why the National Wildlife Refuge System was set up primarily, is these major flyways, our birds are migrating. They need somewhere to stop as well as breed and winter as well. So zoomed in on Missouri here, we can see our big muddy refuge units, for example, Swan Lake National Wildlife Refuge, Mingo National Wildlife Refuge. And even so, I want to draw folks' attention to the fact that these are big areas. They are thousands of acres in some cases, particularly if you look across the country, tens of thousands of acres. But even so, in the context of our entire landscape, these really aren't that big. So even our full service hotels are still not anywhere near the amount of habitat that once existed for our migrating and wintering birds. I do want to focus on Mingo National Wildlife Refuge for a moment. So this is what would be categorized as a full service hotel. This is an extensive, very high quality habitat with a lot of food resources available, very important for birds throughout their life cycle. An example of a convenience store might be Forest Park in St. Louis. It is in the midst of a very hostile landscape, but Forest Park itself is a relatively big area. And many migrating birds use it. I know that if there are folks on here from the St. Louis area, you're probably very familiar with it, but I know that we've all kind of heard of this as an amazing place to see migrants. And that is because it offers this stopover, this convenience store. It's like us like stopping at, the Quick Trip or whatever, to get necessary supplies to continue our journey. And then finally, fire escapes. As the name implies, it's an area that is not necessarily high quality. It doesn't necessarily have a lot of resources to it, but it can provide a place to rest and possibly gain some food resources. So I would think of this prairie strip. So this is a strip that has been planted back to native prairie in the midst of this otherwise entirely agricultural landscape. So can a grassland bird stop over there and potentially rest enough and get enough food to continue moving? Probably. Is it large enough to support breeding grassland birds? Almost certainly not. And what about wintering birds? Maybe it does help with that. It does provide some resources. We're not, again, it's winter, so birds are not looking for particular high quality nest sites. So maybe a fire escape could provide a bit of wintering habitat as well. So just a couple quick examples of birds that do that just pass through Missouri. And again, you'll see as the year goes on, the movement of Wilson's warbler. Mostly in the west, but coming up, yep, breeds very far north and comes back down. So again, no, it does not winter here. It does not breed here. The only part of its life cycle that happens in Missouri is some of the stopover. And if you're a little bird that's doing these long flights and you want to stop in Missouri, you're hoping for full service hotels, or at the least convenience stores. Fire escapes can maybe help a little bit, but probably not a great deal. And another much beloved bird, the Swainson's thrush, that has the same pattern of migrating through Missouri, breeding very far north, and then heading down to Central and South America for the winter. So down to our birds on their southern wintering grounds. One of the things that I heard recently was, given the birds that we think of as ours, particularly during the breeding season, we think of them as our birds, and we're going to go through several examples, but this Kentucky warbler is one, and this dickcissel is another, a forest bird and a prairie bird. There are birds, right? Well, they probably spend maybe 4 months a year in Missouri, and they spend 8 to 9 months a year in other places. So they may be seen more as tropical birds that just happen to be in Missouri for a little bit of time each year, which is, I thought, a very interesting perspective on how to think about our birds. Just some anecdotal observations from birds on their wintering grounds. And this is another area where I'd love folks to put in the chat if you've gone to the tropics, if you've been, fortunate enough to do that, to see some of our quote unquote birds on their southern wintering grounds. I'd be curious if you have some observations of your own that maybe surprised you. One thing that surprised me was seeing ovenbird, which is a forest nesting bird, definitely requires mature forests, nest on the ground. I saw several of them foraging on lawns in Belize, and I was like, what? Ovenbird is a lawn bird. It's a backyard bird here. It's certainly not a backyard bird where I live. So I thought that was kind of an interesting observation. Some things that are quite striking are seeing Baltimore orioles, for example, flocking with other colorful tropical birds. Our species typically remain true to habitat, by which I mean birds that are considered forest birds. They breed in forests here, will be in forests in Central and South America, and prairie birds like our dickcissel here go and winter in grasslands in South America. So remain true to habitat. Okay, I want to check in with a few of our birds on their wintering grounds. Some of these are some favorite birds. A couple of them are fairly common, particularly summer tanager and indigo bunting. Prothonotary warbler can be common in certain places in Missouri. It has a very specific habitat type. And then bobolink, which is a grassland bird. So let's start with prothonotary warbler. I liked this picture because it really showed habitat around this species. So this was taken in some willows on a wetland. You can see a snag there in the background. This is a bottomland forest bird. So it will be in lowlands and typically in or right adjacent to wet areas. There's some great places to see this bird in Missouri. Sarah mentioned that we're headquartered in Arrow Rock, Missouri, down at Jameson Island National Wildlife Refuge, part of the Big Muddy. There are quite a lot of prothonotary warblers during the breeding season in the bottoms down there, for instance. Also certainly in the Boot Heel and along other river bottoms as well. So this species, where does it go? When it leaves Missouri, where does it go? And you can see here, it maintains that affinity for water. You can see it is concentrated in more coastal areas. It was noted by folks at Cornell, amongst others, of course, that they winter in high densities in coastal mangrove forests in Central and Northern South America. So this picture is by Ken Rosenberg of Cornell at the time in Panama, and he noted that mangroves are under extreme pressure from coastal development and aquaculture, and that's what the prothonotary warbler needs. This species does not, as most species do not, it does not change its habitat affinity in the wintertime. It doesn't just say, well, hey, I really need this like super specific bottomland water associated habitat just for breeding, and during the winter I can go find food in a completely different habitat. Its habitat in its wintering grounds is fairly similar to what it is here in its United States breeding grounds. So bobolink, a prairie species of conservation concern. You can see the male here close up, a couple males there. I have a much closer picture of a female. This is a picture taken at Dunn Ranch up in northern Missouri. And I want to play you a video. If it'll take a couple seconds to load here. There we go. I kind of think it sounds like R2-D2 in the Star Wars movies, but a bobolink will do that flight song. We'll do that song while flying, and it's an amazing spectacle. If you have not spent time on the northern Missouri prairies to see this bird on its breeding grounds, um, it is a treat to see them. So you can see here again, this is a map that will show us their migration and wintering geography, but you can see here that it's a long distance migrant that leaves the breeding ground and goes down here to the pampas of of South America. So we'll go ahead and check that out. And I want folks to see what happens between here and there. Let's play this again and really watch where the colors are. Excuse me, let's see, there we go. So what just happened? Now we have none. We had some, now all of a sudden they're showing up, right, in the United States. And we know we saw a little bit of where they stopped in the northwestern tip of South America, and then we see them again down here. So does anyone know what might have happened in the meantime? Don't be shy. It's actually, guesses are welcomed because it's not actually a strange ecological phenomenon. Ooh, hurricane. That's across the ocean. Yep. Sleep. No, well, they do sleep. No MODIS stations, too remote for observation. Yeah, Shannon and Jack, you all are getting really close to this. So Shannon's suggesting no MODIS stations, which it's a technology that is used to track migratory birds that have been tagged with MODIS tags. That is a that is a really good point. There is a dearth of MODIS stations in much of South America. And Jack, too remote for observation. That's probably the closest. So gosh darn, I really would like to play. There we go. So this map, the relative abundance of birds over time is modeled from eBird data. You can see that down at the bottom. And so where are we most likely to get eBird data from? People do use eBird all over the world, of course, but there are a lot more folks using it up here in the bobolink's breeding range. And then we have some observations from the wintering area, but there's, just like MODIS stations, far less eBirding going on here and here than up in the United States. So basically our data are incomplete. We know well where bobolinks winter, we know well where they breed, but we don't have the best idea of exactly where they stop over along the way. And yes, they are a long distance migrant. So the folks that we're talking about crossing the ocean and potential weather events, those would also affect this species as well. Okay. So finally, a bird that I think is near and dear to a lot of folks' hearts, the barn swallow. I believe this is the final animated map, and I wanted you all to see this because this is a global species. The barn swallow that we think of as our barn swallow, Hirundo rustica, is the species. They are found all over the world, and this is what their migration looks like from a global perspective. So barn swallows are aerial insectivores. They take insects on the wing. So it is going to be particularly important for them to be concentrating either their breeding or their wintering in areas where there's high insect abundance. Okay, last couple birds we're going to check in with. So one is the summer tanager. This bird winters in Mexico, Central and South America. They frequent open woodland habitat. So a high canopy, not, when we say open, not a lot of underbrush, not a crowded forest. And they mainly eat insects. So this is their distribution, their range. We see them breeding here, including throughout all of Missouri, even into northern Mexico. And then here's their wintering range. And this is going to become very important. The fact that we see them preferring open woodland habitat and mainly eating insects, and their wintering range. So just a couple views of a young male and a female. You can see that the young male has some of the yellow of a female and is gaining its adult male red plumage here. And then indigo bunting. So this is probably a familiar bird to a lot of folks. It does occur in backyards, and pretty, I wouldn't say it's a habitat generalist, but again, it's a bird that prefers kind of an open woodland habitat. We also often see indigo buntings on tree lines and in treed areas that are adjacent to open habitats, such as prairies and grasslands. And this bird also mainly eats insects. Oop, one more. Indigo buntings, coming off their wintering grounds, will concentrate on the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico right here. They will feed and feed and feed, and they will also make that journey across the Gulf as many other species do. So you can see the high concentration of them here. In April, right before migration, they cross the Gulf, they come up here in pretty dense abundance, and then go back down to their wintering grounds in Mexico and South America, or excuse me, Central America. Couple views of them. We have the female here. We have a young male getting into his bright indigo plumage here, and then we have an adult male up here. So to finish up, and the reason that I wanted to finish up specifically with summer tanager and indigo bunting, that are our birds that are open forest dwelling birds that winter in Central and South America, is there are some very specific ways that we can help these species, even on their wintering grounds, which we as Missourians do not live in. So considering that we have lost a lot of birds, we have seen declines in many, many species, including birds like barn swallows and migratory birds in general. So this gives right here an estimate of a population loss of almost 30% of our migratory birds, and gives an example of Baltimore orioles. And then our grassland birds as well have been in steep decline. So when we're thinking about conserving these species, we often think about our perspective of where we live, and that makes sense. But in order to really help these bird species, we need to start thinking about their full life cycle and where they stop, and certainly where they winter, which is actually in the end where most of them spend most of their time. So here's more of our migrants: rose-breasted grosbeaks, again, Baltimore orioles. Here are some of our wintering birds that folks that are right there in their backyards: dark-eyed juncos, white-throated sparrows, and then resident birds as well. So I believe that probably a lot of folks on this webinar have seen this before. It's a conservation framework devised by the American Bird Conservancy, Cornell, and others, that basically just give us like sort of an easy roadmap to follow, things that we can do in our everyday lives that make significant differences collectively for helping birds. And here are each of them a little bit more visible. But the main one that I want to talk about in terms of our wintering bird species is this one right here. drinking shade-grown coffee. So I know that there are folks on this webinar that saw Monday's edition with Sarah Kendrick about just this exact topic and this topic alone. But I wanted to bring it up tonight because we have a lot of species that, again, we sort of consider them our birds, and they're here for a really important part of their life cycle, which is, of course, breeding. But then they are wintering in areas where how coffee is grown is of critical impact to their conservation. So you can see some of the stats here. We've got 58 species that leave the country entirely during the non-breeding season. And Missouri is particularly important to 49 of these. So we have high concentrations of these birds and major potential conservation impact in Missouri with connectivity to their breeding areas. So of those, we have 42 of our migrant species that overwinter in coffee plantations. So that's why I wanted to end with talking about shade-grown coffee. So these data that you can see here from the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, please note that these are representing both migrants and residents of Central and South America, resident bird species that use these various categories. So 61 bird species, that's a few migrants and few residents. Partial shade, 79, and then in a bird-friendly, shade-grown with native vegetation coffee plantation, there's up to 243 bird species, both migrants and residents, that can live and gather the resources that they need in a shade-grown coffee situation. So here are some of the birds. I'm going to click and it's going to scroll through. These are just some of the birds that I think are going to be familiar to folks in Missouri that are supported by bird-friendly coffee plantations. So catbird, tanager, black and white warbler, wood thrush, really important one, eastern wood pewee, magnolia warbler, chestnut-sided warbler, rose-breasted grosbeak, common yellowthroat, golden wing warbler. There's ovenbird and Tennessee warbler. So that's not all of them, that's just some of them. And there has been a lot of study. I'm going to put a article in the chat when I'm done screen sharing that is a really good piece of investigative journalism about the benefits to birds of shade-grown coffee, the research that lets us know what those benefits are, and some of the actions that you can take to make sure that your coffee is shade-grown. So with that, I want to thank Sarah and Daniel Boone Regional Library for the opportunity to explore all of this ecology of our birds.
Thank you so much, Dana. Yes, she's going to put the stuff in the chat. And I also put a book list that we have for Daniel Boone Regional Library in the chat. And thanks for those of you that answered if there was more than one listening from your location. I appreciate it. And I also wanted to mention, in case you're within driving distance of our library system, please know that Dana will be here in person doing a program for us on Thursday, May 16th at 6:30. So if you want a little road trip, if you're from out of town, come on over to Columbia.
And I think Sarah and I are still taking suggestions for topic of that, aren't we?
That's true. If you have a topic, stick it in the chat tonight that you'd like to see. And it was very interesting to find out about the coffee. I had to stop myself from digging through to see what kind of coffee I have.
Well, here's the article. I don't know why that link is so long, but it should take you right to a Cornell article. It's just a great read on shade-grown coffee. And then my friend Sarah Kendrick's presentation just a few nights ago on this topic entirely. It was a really good deep dive into why it's important and how it's grown and just various aspects.
Oh, that's great. And thanks so much. And for those of you, if you know someone that wanted to be here and couldn't, we did record this, and I'll stop the recording in a second, but it will be up in probably about a week on our library site, dbrl.org. You can get to it from when you go under events. We have all our recordings listed there that you can get to. So thanks so much for coming, guys. I look forward to seeing you in person in May, Dana.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. It's always super fun, and I always get to learn things as well
Me
as
too.
put them together. So
Me too.